Well, we've had a lot of interest on the Level 1 forums to take a look at the ASRock Z370 Gaming K6, and ASRock obliged. Now, I think the reason there's so much interest in the Gaming K6 is because a lot of deal hounds are looking at the feature list and looking at the prices, and they're saying, what's the catch? This motherboard has a lot of features. Well, it does. It's really interesting. Let's take a look. So this is going to be one of those motherboard reviews where we review the motherboard, but we also discover something new and interesting. So this is the Z370 Gaming K6. It's a pretty neat motherboard. It actually has a lot of features, and there's a lot of little details here that ASRock really put some thought into, and it shows, and it ends up being a much better product than you would think. Well, I mean, not that it would be a bad product or anything like that, but it actually ends up being a very, very solid product with just some really relatively minor changes and some really relatively minor improvements. The least of which I'll probably forget to cover in the reviews I'm going to cover right now, is the 3 PCI Express x 1 slots. They're open on the end. So if you're running a device that doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily designed to work with a PCI Express x 1 slot, you can still shove it in there and it'll still work, assuming that the device can do whatever it needs to do and enough bandwidth that PCI Express x 1 connection is all it needs. Little details like that, it's a lot of fun versus having to do it yourself with a Dremel tool. You should never put a Dremel tool on your motherboard, what am I saying? Oh, let's start with the connectors on the motherboard. First up, we've got 2 4-pin fan headers that are right behind the nice heat pipe aluminum heatsink on the 14, well, it's a 12-phase Digi Plus VRM, digital Digi VRM. It's a 12-phase Digi VRM, but there are actually 14 coils because it's like a 12 plus 2, but the plus 2 is for the iGPU, so they don't count that one on this particular motherboard. So good job, honesty in advertising and marketing. It is Nishikon 12K black caps as well, so it's a long life area, and you've got some really high quality, really beefy heat sinks that come with this. Now, ASRock is one of the 2 board vendors that I've looked at that have really seriously upgraded their power delivery system for Coffee Lake. One of the reasons that Intel said, hey, we can't make this backward compatible with Z270 because of power delivery. And if you look at the pinout of the socket, you can see that a lot of pins that were previously marked as reserved and do not use on Z270 are now used for power delivery on Z370. So there is something to that whole backward compatibility thing. And ASRock is one of the vendors that has completely retooled their power delivery area, and it's a really premium solution in my opinion. Of course, you've got the one 8-pin power connector for your CPU. I mean, that can deliver up to 400 watts, but really with Coffee Lake, 150, 200, maybe 215 watts at the upper end with an extreme overclock in the 8700K is what you're gonna get. But, I digress. Moving right along in the motherboard connectors. We've got a physical power and reset button, our 24-pin ATX power connector, 2 front panel USB 3.1 Gen 1 connectors. Then we've got 1 USB Type-C front panel connector. This is a 5 gigabit implementation on this particular motherboard. We've got 8 6 gigabit SATA connections. We can see our first of 2 M.2s. This motherboard actually has 2 M.2 slots. We've got our digital postcode readout, which is really helpful for figuring out if the motherboard is not working. At the bottom edge of the motherboard, we've got our front panel audio connector, an XMP switch on or off. If you want to use XMP, you don't want to go in the UEFI, you're scared to death of the UEFI, you've got UEFI-itis, UEFI-itis, I don't know. You're scared to death of the UEFI, you just turn the switch and it'll use the XMP profile, or at least it'll try to use the XMP profile. You get a standard 50/50 RGB header. This is 12 volts that will deliver up to 3 amps. So if your RGB strip header will use less than 3 amps, you're good to go with this controllable header. Then we've got our Thunderbolt header, a 4-pin fan header, a TPM connector, 3 USB 2.0 headers, RS-232 serial, 1 4-pin fan header, and our front panel connections. So it's pretty cool. Went through that kind of quick because there's a lot to talk about on this motherboard. Got our 3 armored PCI Express by 16 slots. It's by 16 to the CPU or by 8 by 8 to the CPU. So this is an SLI ready motherboard. It uses the PLX PCI Express switches so that you can switch between them, so you can run by 16 or by 8 by 8 directly into the CPU. The other is a by 4 slot that goes through the chipset. Now, just like on Z270, the connection from the chipset to the CPU is a PCI Express 3.0 by 4 equivalent connection. So the maximum that you're gonna get through the chipset, from the chipset to the CPU, is about 4 gigabytes per second, or 32 gigabit, if you wanna think about it that way. And our 2 M.2 slots are routed through the PCH, our 3 by 1s are routed through the PCH. Our onboard NIC is routed through the PCH, our 2 Intel NICs, one of them is routed through the CPU, so it doesn't use any lanes at all because it's got its own resources. The other one is routed through the PCH, as is our Realtek ASRock. Now the audio solution on this is a completely isolated part of the printed circuit board. It uses Nichicon fine gold audio capacitors as well there. It is a Sound Blaster Cinema 3 implementation of the ASRock. It has any 5532 operational amplifiers from Texas Instruments, which will drive headphones up to 600 ohms. So if that's something that you're looking for, Sound Blaster Cinema 3 or whatever like that, you're good to go. In terms of the software bundle, I'll mention really quickly, one of the coolest features in the software bundle is a thing that does not get in the way, and that is the hotkey, macro key, sniper key software from ASRock. This is cool because you can program your own macros on your keyboard, but you can also set up a sniper key on your keyboard, which will alter the sensitivity of your mouse. So if you are, quick scoping or using a scope in on a first-person game like Battlegrounds, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, or Call of Duty or anything like that, you can hold a button down, and so all of a sudden your mouse will be much more sensitive versus what it normally is in software. So you can configure that through the ASRock software, which is pretty neat. Now, in terms of memory support, it is a dual channel DDR4. Officially, the Coffee Lake CPUs support up to DDR4 2666. However, I had no problem getting DDR4 4000 to run on this motherboard. We were using G.Skill Trident Z RGB memory. It's DDR4 4000 dual channel kit. It worked just fine with our i5 test CPU, so that actually worked out really well. Now, another cool feature of this motherboard is the bclk engine. Intel does not want motherboard manufacturers to let you overclock a CPU that is not designed for overclocking. And so motherboard manufacturers do little things to kind of skirt the rules. Asus, for example, has a setting that's called multi-core enhancement, which if your CPU is designed to turbo at 4.7 gigahertz on one CPU, multi-core enhancement will just sort of quietly sneak under the rug and say, oh, we'll just run all the CPUs at 4.7. And that has historically worked even on K CPUs. Well, ASRock, in lovingly giving the finger to Intel with the bclk engine lets you overclock a locked CPU in a way. You can run the CPU at a faster front-side bus speed than 100 megahertz. So your CPU that, say, runs at 4 gigahertz would be 100 megahertz times 40. The multiplier is what's locked, so it doesn't run any faster than 40. But if you could run 125 instead of 100, then you're gonna run 25% faster than 4 gigahertz, or about 5 gigahertz. So 120 to 133, you can actually have pretty decent luck overclocking your CPU for that. Now, ASRock did this previous generation, and Intel pretty much immediately pushed out a microcode update to try to foul if you're running, a clock speed, a bclk clock speed more than about 107 on those locked CPUs, but it's present on this generation, and I'm happy to report, at least for now, it's working on Coffee Lake. So if you're willing to jump through the hoops of running old microcode or deleting the microcode from your UEFI, and you want to get into technical things like that, assuming Intel blocks that kind of a thing in the future, the 6-core i5 this generation with Coffee Lake that's locked is a really incredible deal. It's around 215 US MSRP, and you can overclock, you can overclock that thing to the point that it's actually faster than the 7700K, even though it's a locked CPU and it only costs $200, which is a really good value. Otherwise, if you don't want to fool with that and you want to get an unlocked CPU, this motherboard works great with K CPUs, and I would say that this motherboard would be an easy recommendation for the i5 or the i7K parts this generation with Coffee Lake, just because of all the little features. I mean, the power delivery dual LAN, the audio implementation, the PCI Express layout on this motherboard is basically ideal, the M.2s. It's really solid. It seems really solid in terms of engineering and the features that it gives you and the stuff that's bundled in the box. You even get an SLI bridge. I mean, some boards don't even come with an SLI bridge anymore, so if you want to run SLI, that's the thing you can do. Of course, me, I'll probably run graphics and 10 gig Ethernet, or if you're looking to move up a little bit, you could look at the ASRock Z370 Professional i7. That one has a 10 gigabit Aquantia NIC. That's going to be a separate review. We're going to do that. So it's a lot of fun. Now, Linux support. I know what you're thinking. How is this thing on Linux? Well, because Z370 is basically an incremental improvement over Z270, everything works. You're not going to really have a problem with Linux on this motherboard. The ALC1220 codec is pretty well supported. ASRock hasn't really gotten anything wrong in the UEFI. Basically, everything works as advertised. I would strongly suggest that you set it up in UEFI mode. I did have some trouble trying to do a BIOS boot of an old Linux installation, but the UEFI installation worked fine. That was with kernel 4.14 RC2. So I'm not sure if there are some Linux kernel patches for the new Coffee Lake CPUs. I'm not sure if that's gonna factor in, but it worked pretty well. Now I know what you're thinking, what's the IOMMU situation? Good news, bad news. Good news, the iGPU is in its own group. Most of the peripherals that are hanging off of the PCH chipset, they're in their own group. Any peripherals you put in the 2 slots that are wired into the CPU, so a by 8x8 configuration, both of those are in the same group. So if you're running a dual GPU situation, both of the GPUs would have to pass through to your virtual machine. You would not be able to run one add-in graphics card with the host and one add-in graphics card with your virtual machine. You can, however, run the iGPU with the host machine and an add-in graphics card with a virtual machine. That does work. There are some rough edges around that, so if you're gonna do that before you pull the trigger, wait for the Z370 guide to come out on the Linux channel, like the Z370 pass-through guide to come out. We're not gonna be able to do it with dual GPUs, I can tell you that right now, even with the ACS patch. But all of the other rough edges, where you've got some peripherals that are grouped together, I think we can deal with that with an ACS patch, and because it's not a graphics card, not really gonna be a big deal. So if you zoned out because we were talking about Linux, that's okay, come back, it's gonna be completely fine. It's totally okay. It could be worse. Could be completely way worse. I don't understand. This is actually a really impressive board from ASRock. I'm really happy to see that they've retooled their power delivery system in general on Z370 based on what I've been able to read online. And if you're interested in the particulars, like, you know, what FETs did they use? What sort of other power delivery stuff did they use? The article on the website has some nice high resolution photography. You can take a look at that. There's 60 amp coils, 12K capacitors, like I mentioned. So all in all, it's pretty solid, really. It's a pretty solid board for Z370, and it's definitely worth a consideration. Now it does have an M.2 slot, a third M.2 slot in the top right, sort of near the I/O shield for an optional wireless adapter. So depending on your area and, you know, your geographic region on planet Earth, you may be able to get this motherboard with no wireless, or you may have a choice of, you know, Intel or another provider of a wireless card. You can install your own. If, you know, by default, these manufacturers will use like a 2x2 configuration. If you want something with a little more oomph, you've got an M.2 slot right behind there and you can use for your wireless solution. That's pretty much it for this motherboard, except for a tour of the UEFI. Of course, ASRock has gotten really consistent with their UEFIs across all of their boards. I didn't really see anything untoward or unusual in the UEFI on this system. I was happy to see that the base clock overclocking worked as advertised. It worked really well. That's something not a lot of people consider. It's definitely worth looking at if you've got a locked CPU especially. The other overclocking and voltage delivery, the voltage curves maybe were a little aggressive. So Coffee Lake, it turns out, doesn't really need all that much voltage on average, but a lot of the board manufacturers have to put fairly aggressive voltage profiles in there, because if you're unlucky and you're like in the bottom 50% or the bottom 25% or even the bottom 10%, your CPU is going to need significantly more voltage to work even at stock speeds than somebody in the upper 50% of CPUs distributed. So if you feel like your solution is producing more heat than it should, especially if you haven't done an overclock, or even if you've got a mild overclock, not really an aggressive overclock, feel free to back off the voltage from the default curves. It is entirely possible that your CPU doesn't need those kind of voltages to run. Or you can start overclocking your K CPU without changing the voltage and find the point at which instability creeps in and sort of work with it that way. And that's a much safer alternative than dumping extra voltage into your CPU. So I would suggest that general strategy with Coffee Lake. It's a little unusual versus KB Lake and Skylake that came before it, because there's a lot more variance in chips. And if you are on the bottom 10%, your CPU is gonna need those aggressive voltages. So I don't know, it's interesting. You should report in at the forums at Level 1 Techs and sort of let us know what your overclocks were and what your voltages were, so we can compile a database and put something together. So depending on what you come up with for your overclock and your voltages, it might be awesome if you share your voltages and your clocks at the Level 1 forums, just so we get kind of a baseline. I've only messed around with about 5-ish Coffee Lake CPUs, and there has been a lot of variability, but I have been able to get 4.9 gigahertz or better on all of them and stay under about 80 degrees C with a good cooling solution, not a custom loop, just, you know, all in one or less. So that's pretty impressive. The ASRock Gaming K6 Z370, definitely worth a look. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I missed anything. Wendell signing out. I'll see you in the Level 1 forums. Go Linux, woo! Okay, next time, I'm not gonna have 3 handfuls of M&Ms before doing a motherboard review. I'm gonna go pass out now. Woo!